Last summer, hundreds of people in this country died as a result of heat waves. And already, heat warnings have been issued in many parts of British Columbia and Ontario. What's going on, and if this is happening in our notoriously cold climate, what's happening elsewhere? Let's ask. In Mumbai, India, Arpita Mondal, Associate Professor in Civil Engineering and the Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. In Barcelona, Spain, Rachel White, Assistant Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of British Columbia's Department of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences. And here in our studio, Blair Feltmate, Head of the University of Waterloo's Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so to sort of set up the discussion, I want to set the table. The United Nations World Meteorological Organization has called heat waves the world's deadliest meteorological hazard, impacting every single continent. This year, India experienced its hottest March in more than 120 years. Last summer, in British Columbia, extreme heat killed nearly 600 people. It was the deadliest weather event in Canadian history. In the village of Lytton, residents were exposed to a new Canadian heat record of 49.6 degrees Celsius. That's halfway to the boiling point of water. The town was later hit by wildfire soon after that displaced 1,200 people. Of all climate change-related weather events in this country, extreme heat is the leading cause of death. Blair, I'm going to come to you first. In comparing heat waves to floods and wildfires, your team is now calling heat waves the silent killer. How come?
Because when things go wrong due to climate change and extreme weather risk, and it's generally speaking flooding, wildfires, and extreme heat, when things go wrong relative to flooding and wildfires, it's very financially expensive. It's costly. But generally speaking, nobody dies. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, perhaps maybe 4 people die in floods or fires, which of course, not to be indelicate, is 4 people too many. But when things go wrong relative to extreme heat, that's when people can die, in the hundreds and even potentially into the thousands. And as you referenced, we had 619 people die prematurely in British Columbia last summer. In 2018 in Quebec, we had 86 people die prematurely. But in both of those cases, those people died under what is you might term good conditions. And again, not to be indelicate, but the electricity was running. Had the electricity gone out during those heat waves and fans and air conditionings weren't running, those deaths would have popped into the high hundreds, if not thousands.
All right, Arpita, I wanted to get your take on that. What do you think about when we talk about heat waves being a silent killer?
Yeah, I very much agree to that statement. In India, heat waves are not even recognized as a significant natural disaster as per our National Disaster Management Act. So although we see in the recent years, more and more of these events show up, particularly the post-2000s, that's the period where a lot of heat wave events have happened in India. But, their features keep changing. And although India is not a stranger to heat waves, they happen pretty frequently in this part of the world. But their features keep changing, like for this year, for example, this year it happened much earlier than its regular period of occurrence. And it was also far more widespread. And it also led to more significant impacts and even, threatening food security of the country. So it's quite significant that way.
All right, we'll get into that a little later. I want to actually take a look at what parts in this country, both smaller cities and smaller communities and larger cities, should be most concerned about heat waves in the future. This is from your recent report, Blair. We're going to go from west to east. In BC, low-lying areas from the west coast to the Rockies. As we travel east in the prairies bordering the U.S., we're talking about cities like Regina and Winnipeg, and closer to home here in Ontario, north of Lake Erie through the St. Lawrence River Valley. We're talking about cities like Windsor, Hamilton, Niagara, Ottawa, and Montreal. Rachel, we think of ourselves as a frigid northern country, but it turns out Canada is quite vulnerable to extreme heat. Why are we susceptible to heat waves?
Well, I think part of it is because we're not used to this level of heat. As you say, we think of ourselves as a colder country. And so as the climate is warming up due to human activities, that sort of extreme heat is edging its way into these colder climates. And we're not used to that. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure to cope with these extreme heat events. And that can cause, as we've seen, devastation and devastating impacts.
All right, I want to pull up another graph. This is a graph that shows how extreme heat is on the rise in Canadian cities and towns. The yellow bar shows the average number of very hot days per year communities have typically had from 1976 to 2005. And what constitutes a very hot day in this example is 30 degrees Celsius or higher. The red bar to the right is a forecast of the number of very hot days residents could suffer through if greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase at current rates to the end of this century. So we're looking similar cities that we saw in Ontario, Windsor, Hamilton, Niagara Falls. Look at Windsor, for example, in the yellow when we talk about very hot days in 1976 to 2005, we're looking at about just over 20. But when we look at from 2051 to 2080, we're nearing 80. Blair, I want to come to you. We can see from the graphs that cities are even more at risk of extreme heat. It's due to something called the urban heat island effect. How does that work?
Yeah, just the physicality of cities themselves. They add to the heat wave that would be there independent of the city being there. And we have things in cities, for example, that contribute to heat. For example, anybody who's flown into any one of these cities, when you look down on the rooftops of factories and shopping malls and apartment buildings, for example, almost universally everything is dark. It's black tar. When sunlight hits that dark surface, only a very small amount of that energy reflects back up into space. Most of the energy stays in the system and contributes to heating in the city. But if we were to paint these roofs white, literally put a white surface on them, when the sunlight hits that surface, about 80% of the energy will reflect back up into space and only a smaller amount stay in the system. So relatively speaking, we can be cooler than if we weren't to engage this activity. So there's a number of activities like that within cities we can engage to at least minimize the heat island effect.
Do we have a sense of how sort of the difference in surface temperature when we're talking about a rural area to an urban area?
As a rule of thumb, it's about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer in cities as a result of the heat island effect at the level, the surface level where people would be walking around.
Pretty significant. Now, curious, what sorts of people are most vulnerable to the deadly effects of heat waves?
Yeah, so there's 3 primary groups in the country that are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat. Number 1 is the elderly, and these are people greater than 70 years of age, generally speaking, living on their own, perhaps in the back of a rooming house somewhere. So we need to keep track of where are those people. We need to know where they are and check on them during heat waves to make sure they're hydrated. Do they have an air conditioner? Do they have a fan? That's the first group. Second group are the homeless. We need roving teams in cities during heat waves to check on the homeless to say, do they know where the cooling center is? Do they need a drive to a cooling center? Are they hydrated? And then the third group are people with pre-existing health conditions, generally speaking respiratory in nature. We need to have heat alerts go out to give them time to put themselves in a situation where they're not in harm's way when the heat event hits. So those are the 3 primary groups.
All right, Rachel, I want to come to you. I want to get a sense of what this extreme heat does to humans and our human body. There is something called the wet bulb temperature factor, and the wet bulb temperature. And I want to get a sort of a layman terms explanation of how this works. It's quite phenomenal when you think about it, but I don't think a lot of people understand that your body needs to breathe.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not actually just temperatures in these extreme heat events that matter. It's temperatures and humidity. And so that's what this wet bulb temperature essentially combines, is the temperature of the air and the humidity of the air. And the reason that's important is that humans cool down, and we cool down by sweating, and then that sweat evaporates from our skin. And it's that evaporation that takes energy away from our skin and puts it into the gas. The liquid is no longer liquid, it's now a gas. And that actually cools down our skin and the air very close to our skin. But if the air is really humid, many of us have experienced this. When you sort of have a very humid day, you feel sticky. You don't actually evaporate that sweat from your body. It's just sort of dripping off you sometimes. And that's not helping us cool down. That's just making us feel sticky and unpleasant. And so that's why the humidity of the air matters. If air is drier, more evaporation can take place from our bodies. We're able to keep ourselves cool with that sort of human mechanism. But when the air is hot and humid, essentially that sweat doesn't evaporate, and so we can't cool ourselves down. And at a certain wet bulb temperature, essentially our bodies can no longer cool themselves, and we can just overheat and sort of almost cook from the inside.
Is it deadly in that sense? Like, how does that get us to sort of organ failures when we look at Lytton, BC, where in British Columbia, where 600 people died? What was the case there?
Yes, so it certainly can be deadly. And so essentially, wet bulb temperatures of more than around 35 Celsius can be deadly for humans in about 6 hours if we don't have another way to cool down. Like even if we have water, if we don't have a way to cool ourselves, then that can be deadly. And it often is, as we've seen in so many of these devastating heat events.
Arpita, India is one of the countries most affected by extreme heat. You gave us a little taste of sort of what's been happening at the top. We had mentioned that you had suffered through the hottest March on record. I'm hoping you can give us a sense of how the impacts on daily life have been so far in your area.
Yeah, so this year's heat wave was pretty unique in the sense that, unlike the previous years where it had occurred in the months of May and June, which are typically known to be prone to heat waves, this year, March and April were really, really hot. And, there are coastal cities where a combination of heat and humidity, as Rachel was explaining, play a big role in human health and morbidity and mortality. So what had happened also was that a large part of the country, so unlike the heat wave pockets, we had about 70% of the country reeling under the heat wave in March and April. And that time of the year is also the time of, it's the growing season of the crop wheat, which is the second most important staple crop in India. So what happened was that because wheat is also a crop which is highly sensitive to temperature changes, a lot of wheat productivity was affected adversely because of the heat wave. And India had initial plans of supplementing global food supplies, particularly considering the Ukraine crisis in mind. But then the country was forced to stop all the export of wheat. And other than the vulnerable populations and communities which Blair was mentioning, in India, we also have a lot of daily wage workers. So these are laborers who work on a daily wage basis. And if they don't show up for the work, they won't get paid. A large part of our labor force is actually daily wage workers. So their working hours were affected. And of course, in India, a lot of the reporting also is underestimated. And heat waves related death is also very hard to report in the sense that, somebody with a pre-existing condition might actually die of a heart attack. In that case, it will not be recorded as a heat wave related mortality. So these are all some of the challenges which face our country when it comes to heat waves.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard stories that it's so hot right now in India that you could literally cook an egg in your house without using a stovetop or anything like that.
That is unfortunately true. And, not from this year, but I've seen videos in YouTube from previous years where in a southern state of Telangana, there's a woman who puts an egg on her floor and it gets fried. It's literally that hot. I am from Mumbai where, it might be actually 35 degrees Celsius, but it feels like a 42 because of the humidity. So that also comes into play.
Very interesting. Blair, I'm going to come to you. So 500,000 Torontonians live in old apartment buildings higher than 8 stories, nearly all of which lack central air conditioning. Many also lack backup power generation. You've called this a disaster in the making. Why?
Yeah, it is a disaster in the making. So if we get an extreme heat event combined with an electricity outage, and there's only backup power generation to run elevators for maybe 2 or 3 hours, and that's it, you can have people on, particularly above the 6th or 7th floor in a building, without access to air conditioning or fans running. But also, I mentioned 6th or 7th floor because just under normal city water pressure, water won't go above the 6th or 7th floor in an apartment building if the pumps go out, if the electricity goes out. So you could have perhaps an elderly couple on the 16th floor in a building somewhere with no air conditioning, no fan, no water, and and elevators not running. So this is a deadly combination of factors.
All right, Rachel, I want to come to you when we talk about sort of heat waves in the conversation of climate change. How much can we honestly say climate change is responsible for this global rise in heat waves?
So how much climate change is contributing to any particular heat wave is a complicated question, and scientists work very hard to sort of work out by how much did climate change increase the probability and the intensity of this event. But overall, we can say that mean temperatures are rising. We know that. They're rising because of the increase in greenhouse gases. We know that. And that increase in temperature is going to lead to an increase in heat waves. And so we know for a fact that this is being caused by human activity and the greenhouse gases we're putting into our atmosphere. For any particular event, it is more complicated. But yes, this global rise we're looking into is being caused by us.
Is there a connection, Rachel, to heat waves and other dangerous events like wildfires and floods?
Yes, there is. And so interestingly, during the BC heat wave last year in June, we know you spoke earlier about the wildfire in Lytton, but actually that heat wave was sort of the precursor to a very bad wildfire season across British Columbia. And part of that is that heat really just evaporated a lot of the moisture from the vegetation, from the ground. And so it just dried everything out and made everything sort of much more likely to catch fire. And so then when we had lightning strikes, there were a lot of lightning strikes that were in fact induced by previously burning wildfires and the meteorology that existed because of those fires. We then sort of led to more and more wildfires being ignited on a land that was incredibly dry. We also saw flooding and record stream flows. And so that was related to snowmelt and glaciers melting at very high speeds because of the high temperatures. And so actually, even during the heat wave, there were some evacuation alerts issued within BC for flooding at the same time as we have these record-breaking heat temperatures.
Arpita, it's now been accepted by the United Nations that many of the impacts of global warming are irreversible. We can reduce its effects, but we can't eliminate it. So how much should we be focusing specifically on adapting to these heat waves?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I always begin the answer to this question by saying that, unless the root cause is addressed, we cannot go too far. So, of course, cutting down emissions is something that has to be done, because if greenhouse gas emissions are continued as they are right now, we are only seeing that this is going to be more frequent and more intense in future. So that's the root cause that has to be addressed. Having said that, there's a huge onus on the federal and state government agencies here in India to recognize heat waves as a potential significant natural disaster and also come up with specific heat action plans. We do see a couple of such examples in Indian cities, which have been, like, I can give you an example of the Ahmedabad city, which is in the western part of India, which suffered from a massive heat wave in 2010. Then they came out with their own heat action plan in 2013. And ever since, the city has been fairly successful in dealing with heat waves. Similarly, the city of Mumbai, the city of Surat, these are the first few South Asian cities to come up with their own climate action plans. Concrete measures such as these, both at the federal as well as the state levels, need to be in place. And I also think that the press and media also has a big role, particularly in India, to play on this, because there is not much public awareness. We are a highly populated, highly densely populated country, but there is not much awareness in terms of, people realizing how dangerous it is for them, how long they should stay outdoors if they cannot avoid staying outdoors, how frequently they should hydrate, when should schools be shut, and what sort of modifications can be adopted at their own local household levels. Because remember, we are talking about a population where thousands of people do not even have access to fans, let alone ACs. So a lot of public awareness also is needed in that direction.
Blair, you're doing some very important work. You're working with the Minister of Environment to develop Canada's extreme heat adaptation plan. What sorts of steps? You talked a little bit about some steps that we can take. What steps can we take to adapt?
Yeah, so we're outlining programs that are behavioral in nature. We talked earlier about programs that can be put in place to protect the elderly, the homeless, people with pre-existing health conditions. So that's behavioral adaptation. Then within cities, we can engage efforts like, for example, to work to retain and restore tree canopy in the city to provide more shade. We can work with building owners and apartment building owners to put glazing on windows and shutters on windows to keep the heat from entering into an apartment building or condo tower during a heat wave. But probably right at the top of the list is a new transition for the country. We need a heat alert system, almost like an Amber Alert, but for a heat alert, not just in British Columbia, which is now invoking that system, but for provinces right across the country to give everybody a heads up that the heat wave is coming, it's dangerous. Putting it in Amber Alert mode really gets people to pay attention, and that should trigger the whole set of actions to put into action plans to put in place to mitigate the risk.
Rachel, I want to come to you when we talk about all levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal. Are they taking heat waves seriously enough?
That's a good question. Certainly in BC, in the wake of this heat wave, it is being taken very seriously. And as Blair just mentioned, right, the BC government is doing quite a lot to create this new extreme heat emergency and what that would entail when that sort of system is started up by a forecast of an extreme alert. But it is one of those things that unfortunately, until a region experiences it, they often sort of think that, as we were saying earlier, well, maybe we don't need to worry about heat. And I think the heat wave that we had in British Columbia that shattered records, and it was so unprecedented for this region and had these really severe impacts, we know that regions are going to continue to see hotter heat waves and more frequent heat waves as the climate continues to warm. And so really we are sort of urging other jurisdictions, other governments to consider this now. Don't wait until after you've had an event that has killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Recognize that climate change is happening and we need to do something about what that means if there was an extreme heat emergency in that local region and how we could mitigate those impacts.
Blair, I found this interesting. Florida's Miami-Dade County now has what they're calling the world's first chief heat officer. Is there anything Canadian governments should be considering that they refuse to?
Yeah, we've actually created in Canada now the equivalent of a chief resiliency officer. So not just for heat, but for floods and fires and so forth. And it's in the form of Bill Blair, Minister for Emergency Preparedness. So he, along with Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of the Environment, the two of them are doing a very fine job, by the way, that looking at how we could advance, operationalize adaptation in this country to prepare for the events that for sure are coming. And the primary focus is on flooding, fire, and extreme heat. So we're getting there.
What do you think the wake-up call could be for Canadian politicians so that they really start to pay attention here?
Well, adaptation has started to take hold in about the last 2, 3, 4 years with major events going on around the country and across the world to really illustrate that with things going wrong that we have to prepare, and we have to prepare rapidly. But we still, to a certain extent, have a system of management based on disaster. We wait till the disaster occurs and then we hop on it. What I worry about is the fact that there may be an extreme heat event that occurs, that it's not 619 people dying prematurely, but thousands of people dying prematurely due to extreme heat. And that may be the point at which the Canada really turns the corner on this file to really embrace a sense of urgency in reference to preparing for extreme weather events. I hope that doesn't happen, but that may be the case.
I do have to ask a question, a fair question, I think. Your university department is sponsored by the Intact Insurance Company.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that it's in your department's interest to sort of play up the most serious predictions in heat waves in hopes that people will buy more insurance?
No, not really. The way I look at it is the greater the degree to which we can get the risk out of the system, period, everybody benefits. Homeowners benefit, the insurance company would benefit, municipalities benefit, and provincial and federal governments benefit. Everybody benefits by getting the risk out of the system, and that is the goal, period.
Arpita, I want to come to you. Due to this increase in heat waves, could there be countries in the world that become uninhabitable to humans in the next century?
Yes, that looks like, I mean, it's not a distant, bad dream anymore, because we do have parts of India reaching up to 50 degrees Celsius this year. The national capital of Delhi recorded a 49 degrees Celsius temperature, which are very, very difficult to habitate conditions. There are parts of the Middle East which are also projected to, reach record-breaking temperatures. And we must also realize that heat waves might not always, necessarily be isolated events. They have cascading effects, effects on wildfires and floods, as we saw, but also on droughts in India. And, ours is an agriculture-dependent economy. The rainfall, the monsoon is everything for us. And if you have desiccated soils leading to very dry conditions of the soil, low soil moisture, it's eventually going to affect food security of the country. So the effects are going to be trickled down the economy. And not just that, from the recent stopping of the export of wheat, we also see that this has implications for global food security as well.
Rachel, I want to get your take on this as well. What does this mean when we look at sort of the next century and uninhabitable places in this world?
Yeah, it's scary when we hear reports like that. And I think the thing that I find most important to remember is that often when we look at these predictions for how hot it's going to get, we often look at, well, what if we continue greenhouse gas emissions at the current rate? And what I really want to get across is that we have a choice here. We've already put in a certain amount of warming. There's already going to be more than we have today. Even if we immediately, instantaneously stopped emitting greenhouse gases across the world today, temperatures would continue to rise. And so we really need to act now. We have a pretty small window in which we can act in order to not hit some of these worst case scenarios that we're talking about, that we're hearing about. They are scary, and that's why we need to do something about it now.
Blair?
Well, I think there's a third leg to this stool. And so in reference to dealing with climate change, we need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. We need to embrace adaptation and deal with extreme weather events. But the third leg of the stool is carbon capture and sequestration. We've actually got to get the carbon out of the air. And I think we need the equivalent internationally of a Manhattan Project to figure out how to do this practically, cost effectively, en masse. So there's three legs to the stool. And if any one of those legs collapses, the whole system comes down.
So Blair, when we have this conversation about heat waves and climate change, there is still a portion of the population that does not believe in climate change. What is the message to that population when we're trying to tackle heat waves, floods, and everything else that's coming our way?
Well, for people who simply don't accept the fact that climate change has happened, that it's real, they nonetheless can see the floods, the fire, and the more extremes in temperature. So my sense is they should look at that and say, even if you don't believe climate change is the causal mechanism, we still have to prepare for these extremes in weather that are occurring, independent of what they may believe is the cause. So we certainly need that preparedness in place in reference to how people view these systems. And overall, what we need to do, by the way, is develop a strong sense of urgency on the need to act to alleviate risk associated with these factors. In my opinion, and for Canada right now, the one thing that's missing more than anything is a sense of appreciation of the need to act with urgency to alleviate the risk that's in the system now and the greater risk that's coming due to climate change. Even if people don't accept that climate change is real, that is the reality.
Rachel, Arpita, Blair, thank you so much for your insights. There's obviously a lot of work to be done on this front when we talk about climate change and heat wave, but thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.